It's going to make it any better.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak at second reading for Bill C7 pertaining to the Senate. And as many of my colleagues have outlined today in the House from the NDP, this is a bill that we have a lot of concerns about. And the first thing I want to point out that this is the third time that the Conservative government has introduced this legislation. So it makes you wonder whether or not it is indeed a priority with the Conservative government that they've let it go so long, despite repeated campaign promises and even going back to the reform days of an elected Senate and so on. So, Mr. Speaker, when examining this bill, for the NDP, there are several major issues that we have concerns about with this bill and find it not supportable. I mean, I think the most basic premise with this bill is that it's bringing forward measures that are really half measures and are not going to fundamentally deal with what is a very undemocratic institution. We know that the Senate has been around for a very long time. Certainly for the NDP, we've been calling for the abolition of the Senate since going back to the 1930s. And when one looks at this bill, it's being put forward under the guise of democratic reform. It's being put forward under the guise that this will improve the Senate, it will make it more accountable. But fundamentally, even though provinces may choose to have a process to elect senators, there's nothing in this bill that actually compels the Prime Minister to actually adopt those electorally based decisions, elections that have taken place. The fact of the matter is the Prime Minister would still be free to appoint whomever she or he chooses. And that's because of a constitutional question. We understand that. But it gets to the very heart of this bill, that it will possibly go through legal challenges, and it actually doesn't in any fundamental way bring a greater measure of democracy to Parliament itself overall, and that's something that we're very concerned about, Mr. Speaker. For us in the NDP, we've taken a different tack. First of all, we've called on the government in this House through motions that we've presented and had debated. We've called on the government to actually hold a referendum that would ask the Canadian people whether or not they support abolishing the Senate. And we think that that's a fair thing to do. This debate over the Senate, whether it should be there or not, whether it should be elected or what form it should take, has now gone on for decades. So we believe that it's a fair and proper question that actually should be put to Canadians as to what they see as the future of the Senate. We know that in recent polls there's a growing appetite to actually deal with this question. For example, in July just of this year, 71% of Canadians were in favour of holding a referendum to decide the future of the Senate, and 36% of Canadians actually do support abolition of the Senate, and that's up from about 25% a year previous. So we know that this is an issue that people are concerned about, but there's no question that this bill absolutely is a sort of the lowest denominator, is a low bar and a very minimal attempt to deal with a fundamental question of democratic reform in our country. Now, just speaking on the bill itself before I get to a broader question, I think there is concern that if this bill goes through, which it will with this majority government, no doubt, even though it's been before us 3 times now, if it does finally go through on this time around, having an elected Senate, if that's what turns out to be, that local elections take place in provinces and those people are then appointed to the Senate, that it will actually create a very odd entity down the hall in the Red Chamber. It will in effect create a 2-tier Senate where it's very possible that those who have been elected will feel that they have more legitimacy, because you'll have people who have not been elected and you'll have people that have not been elected. So we could actually end up with a very strange combination. And I think in terms of real operations of how the Senate would operate, it could produce significant problems. And we could end up with the same kind of difficulty or gridlock that we've seen in the United States that I think people abhor. Now, some people say you have to have a Senate, you have to have an upper chamber. And I would remind all of us that in actual fact, in provincial legislatures, the Senate provisions were abolished many, many years ago. And in fact, all provincial senates were abolished in 1968, and apparently the provinces and their legislatures have been able to function in a proper manner since that abolition. So I think that argument that we have to have this upper chamber is a bogus argument. Obviously, there are people who support the Senate, but there's also a very strong case to be made that we would be much better, and this is the main argument I want to make, Mr. Speaker, that we would be much better if we focus democratic reform on our system overall. And of course, here we are in the House of Commons. We are elected in our 308 ridings and constituencies across the country, soon to possibly increase those seats. And yet there is a fundamental issue here about the process and the manner of that election. The first past the post system that we have is a system that actually doesn't reflect the way people are voting. And so the makeup of the number of seats in this House does not, unfortunately, reflect the way people are actually voting. The representation by party is not reflecting the actual vote. And so a system of proportional representation is a far superior and much more accountable form of an election for the House of Commons or any institution, and is something that we in the NDP have long advocated. And I do want to say that that too has been a big issue across the country. We've seen several referendums provincially. We've had two in British Columbia. There was one in Ontario. There was one in, I think it was New Brunswick, but I could be wrong on that, certainly in the Maritimes. And so there has been a very healthy debate amongst Canadians about the need to have democratic reform. And yet here, at the federal level, there's been a deafening silence. Certainly, New Democrats have pursued this issue with vigor. We've worked with organizations like Fair Vote Canada, and we've been very involved in a very healthy debate about democratic reform. And so for us, we believe that the real course of action that's needed here, the change that is actually required that could help transform the political process and the way people feel about their involvement in the political process, is to bring forward initiatives around proportional representation. And of course, we should begin here in the House of Commons. And so to have a process to do that, we came close to that in, I think it was about 2002 or 2004, when the former Member of Parliament, Ed Broadbent, who was the member for Ottawa Centre, was very active and worked very closely with the government of the day, the Liberal government, and we almost got to the point where we had a process that would have begun to examine this question of democratic reform as it affected the House of Commons. Unfortunately, nothing proceeded, as was often common with the government of that day. There was promises made, but were not followed through. And we didn't make any progress on that issue. But subsequent to that, we've had vigorous debate at provincial levels about democratic reform. And in the provinces that I mentioned, that debate has specifically taken place sometimes over what's called STV, or the single transferable vote. It's had, there are, again, arguments on both sides of that, but what was important was that there was an identification by voters that they wanted to engage in a debate and a conversation about changing the electoral system to make it fairer, to make it more accountable, and to make it more democratic. And so, Mr. Speaker, that's really, I guess, the disappointment of the debate that we have here today. We're failing to address the very pressing issue of democratic reform, where people are voting for their own Member of Parliament. We could engage in a process where we could adopt a position that would ensure that we do have a much more open sense of democratic voting and accountability. And in fact, there are many countries around the world. Most democracies have some form of proportional representation. We're now one of the very few countries that does not. So to us, This is a missed opportunity, that here we are having this debate on the Senate that in and of itself is going to possibly produce a quagmire of legal questions, and we're missing the boat on the fundamental question of democratic reform for the House of Commons. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question, commentaire. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Nickel Belt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
To ask the honourable member from Vancouver East, who happens to be the health critic for the NDP, a hypothetical question. Pardon? Okay. I'd like to ask her a hypothetical question. A couple of weeks ago, we had a motion here in the House to ban asbestos. And a conservative after conservative got up in the House and said that asbestos doesn't cause cancer. Even the good doctor from Simcoe Gray, who voted against her former colleagues, the good doctors of this country, who voted against scientists, who voted against what Canadians really want, and who voted to help spread cancer in underdeveloped countries. Hypothetically speaking, if the Conservatives had voted for this motion and it had gone to the Senate, what could have happened to that motion once it got to the Senate?
Well, member for Vancouver East.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his very good hypothetical question. I love hypothetical questions. The fact is that one of the problems is that when measures do pass the House of Commons, they go to the Senate, as we saw with the climate change bill that was twice adopted by the House of Commons through a Democratic majority vote, was sent to the Senate and was buried. It was completely buried under whatever business is taking place there, and it was thoroughly undemocratic. So I think the member on a very important issue around asbestos, and you know, every medical authority internationally and certainly in Canada has pointed out the dangers of this carcinogen and the dangers to our health and our population. And so on that very important issue, if we had managed to get something through, if it had gone to the Senate, well, we have a Senate that's now chock-a-block full with the most appointed senators we've ever seen by one Prime Minister under this Conservative government. So it does speak to the inability of the Senate to act in a proper manner, and it comes back to the question of the need for real democratic reform.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for her remarks, and I will agree with her party that the Senate does need to be reformed. But there's an argument that is being made that I once made before, but I think it's wrong, and that is making a comparison to the provincial legislatures, which do not have upper houses. And the difference is that provinces are much more homogeneous than Canada as a whole. And the Senate was created partially because there are very different geographic regions of Canada with different history, different needs that need to be balanced. And there are parts of the country which just don't have as many people as other parts of the country. And in order not to disadvantage those regions, the Senate was created. And so I wonder if she would care to comment about that, that there is a real qualitative difference between Canada as a whole and the diversity across the whole country as compared to, say, a provincial legislature.
Well, member for Vancouver East.
Well, I thank the member for his comment. I think it's a very thoughtful comment, and certainly the differences that we face federally are much greater than we would see provincially, but we still see them provincially. You take any province, whether it's Quebec or whether my own province of British Columbia, and again you'll see a wide variety and diversity of regions and interests, and people are represented. I mean, we live in a vast country. Our provinces are enormous territories. And so the fact that our legislatures have been able to operate very effectively, and that's not saying we agree with everything they do. There's obviously very vigorous political debate that takes place. But they've been able to not only survive, but to function properly without the necessity of a Senate. And I think the same argument is true here. I would much rather that we focus on things like proportional representation for the House of Commons as a true, meaningful, genuine process of democratic reform than mucking around with the Senate and coming up with some kind of strange hybrid, when in actual fact we should be putting to the people of Canada, do we need the Senate in any event, and should it be abolished?
Resuming debate.